Hi, everyone. We are live with this week's Stripe Developer Office Hours. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Cecil Phillip. I'm a developer advocate here at Stripe. And if this is your first time being at Stripe Developer Office Hours, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate you. Definitely feel free to use the chat to ask any questions you might have. Go ahead and let us know too. Where are you calling in from or where are you watching from? Definitely love to know where folks are chiming in from and building things from. We have a really fun and interesting conversation we're going to have today. We're going to be talking about Stripe and Dapr and showing how we can put those two together to build really interesting developer workflows, payment workflows using those two different technologies. But before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and jump into a couple of updates just to kind of show folks what has been going on within the world of Stripe over the last couple of days, weeks or so since we were last here. That's not the screen I want to put up. All right, great. Let's start with this one. So over on our Stripe Developers YouTube channel, so that's Stripe Developers and not the corporate Stripe channel, we just released a new video. This one just came out yesterday, I believe, talking about the difference between Stripe event destinations versus webhooks. And if for folks are familiar, we just released event destinations, I want to say it was Q4 of last year. So, still pretty new and fresh for a lot of folks. And, I know a lot of you had questions about like, where did my webhooks go? Like what happened and so on and so forth. So this video here, we put this out so you can understand a little bit about like how that works and what those two things are. If you head over to stripe.dev, our Stripe developer blog, we have a new blog post that talks about our new AI assistant. Now, if folks are using VS Code, if you install the Visual Studio Code extension for Stripe, it'll come with the AI assistant, and so you could use it just like you do at Stripe, and prompt it and ask it questions and things of that nature. So it's out and it's released, and it'll allow you to ask a lot of Stripey questions. I don't know if that's a thing, but it'll allow you to ask a lot of Stripey questions to your application, and it'll help you build out using our Stripe SDKs and things of that nature. So definitely recommend that you check that out. Another interesting blog post that just got released, this one has to do with data pipeline. And if folks are unfamiliar, Stripe Data Pipeline allows you to export your Stripe data into different data warehouses. So things like Snowflake or AWS Redshift. And as you can see here, we have support for exporting your data over into Google Cloud Storage, and then you can start querying it with Google BigQuery. So that's what this blog post talks about. So if you're GCP customers, Google Cloud customers, definitely go ahead and check this out so you could see how to get your Stripe data into your Google Cloud account so you could start issuing queries and doing some fun stuff with that too. Now, just a couple more announcements left. Excuse me. In April, so just next month, we will be having another Stripe developer meetup. This is going to be in our Chicago office. So if any of you folks are in Chicago, definitely make sure you come over and check that out. This will be on April 10th, and we'll have tons of, there'll be food and drinks, and, we'll have some really fun and interesting presentations happening there as well. So again, if you're in Chicago, definitely check us out on April 10th for another Stripe developer meetup. And last but not least, I want to call out, we are having our Stripe conference, Stripe sessions. This is going to be May 6th through 8th, right? May 6th through 8th. It's going to be in San Francisco. So if you're around and you want to come and hang out with the DevWorld team, with some of the folks from the field, the product folks, and our engineers, definitely come by and hang out and say hi and learn about some of the new and interesting updates we have going on within the world of Stripe. Now, that's all the updates that I have. I'm going to take my screen off, and I'm going to bring on our guest, Marc. So glad to have you.
Thanks, Cecil.
Folks that might not know who you are, what do you do? Why don't you give us like a little bit of an introduction?
Yes. So hi, everyone. I'm Marc Duiker. I'm a developer advocate at Diagrid, a company founded by the co-creators of Dapr open source. I'm also one of the community managers of Dapr. And well, we do like similar things once every week to show latest news about Dapr. And I also create a lot of content and demos about Dapr. And well, that's actually also one of the things I will touch upon during this office hours.
Nice. So Marc, I'm really glad that you came because I get a lot of questions from folks asking, how does Stripe and Dapr work together? right? Like, how can I build my applications with them? Like, what,
Yes.
like, what does that even look like? What do I use? Like, how do I compose like a financially based application with Dapr? So I'm really glad you're here to be able to answer some of those questions.
Excellent.
So, but before we dive into like architecture and the different
Mhm.
APIs and all that type of stuff,
Yeah.
could you just tell me what is Dapr? Like, what is the elevator pitch for what is Dapr and what value does it bring to developers?
Yeah, definitely. I think I would also like to share my screen then, because it's nice to have a kind of bit of a visual.
Sure.
Yeah, so Dapr is used by a lot of companies who are building microservices and event-driven architectures, because Dapr provides a lot of APIs that developer can use to build well secure and reliable services. So, for instance, if you want to do like async messaging using events and use message brokers, you can use Dapr for that, because Dapr has a PubSub API. But all of the APIs that Dapr offers, they abstract away the underlying infrastructure. So that's very important to realize. So in this visual here, you see like message broker, database, and workflow, but Dapr itself is not a message broker, and Dapr itself is not a database, but Dapr provides APIs, and then you can configure Dapr to use like any type of message broker or any type of state store under the covers. So that's really what sets it apart from all kinds of other solutions where you're usually tied to like one specific message broker or one specific state store. So with Dapr, you're actually very flexible, and you can change on the underlying message broker or change an underlying state store without changing your application code.
So is it fair for me to say that Dapr is almost like an abstraction over, let's say, a common set of bits of functionality, essentially, right?
Exactly.
But like
Yeah.
now, me as a developer, I don't have to think too much about what the thing on the other side is. I just talk to the API, and I can kind of leave it up to my operations team, my infrastructure team, or whoever to kind of like figure that part out.
Exactly correct. Yeah, and there's also a diagram a bit lower here on Dapr.io. By the way, this is the main website of Dapr, that explains how Dapr solves platform engineering challenges. And the blue box here, highlights what Dapr offers, and all of these icons are all of the different Dapr APIs. And we'll have a look at Dapr workflow mainly in this session. So Dapr is like a very broad project. It offers like 12 APIs at the moment, and that's also like increasing every year. So also that API service is increasing, but it allows you to connect to all kinds of different infrastructure resources that you can see here. And this is just a small subset of what's available. In total, you can connect to 120 different infrastructure resources. But yes, Dapr provides like pretty basic APIs, which are very easy to understand. So you don't have to learn a very specific API if you want to do like PubSub messaging. So you don't have to learn, for instance, the Kafka API if you want to use Kafka as a message broker. And maybe later, maybe you're starting out with something like a RabbitMQ, when you're maybe developing locally, but maybe then you want to switch to Kafka, or maybe you want to switch to Azure Service Bus. And so that means you need to learn all these individual SDKs if you want to use all of them. But with Dapr, you only need to learn one SDK. That's the Dapr SDK, which has like a very simple PubSub method. And then under the hood, you can configure which resource you use by configuring these YAML files.
Nice. And you mentioned a couple of times that so Dapr exposes these APIs. So using those languages at the top, right? Like I could, I'm guessing I download like, I don't know, like an NPM package or a Python thing or a .NET NuGet package or whatever the case is, right? And then
Yes.
I run whatever configuration I can talk to Dapr, right?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, and by the way, so Dapr does offer all these client libraries which you can use, but Dapr runs as a process next to your application, so it doesn't run in the same process, but next to your process. You can also make like straight HTTP or gRPC calls to the Dapr runtime, so you don't necessarily need to use any of our client SDKs if you don't want to, but sometimes it does make it a bit easier to talk to this Dapr process, especially with type languages such as .NET and Java, for instance.
Okay. So I almost want to say like the SDK is optional. Like
Yes.
I can use the SDK, or
Exactly.
I could just call the API directly, right? Because like you had mentioned, I could just use HTTP, HTTPS, and then just talk directly to the Dapr process to access those APIs that I want to work with.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's like a bit of a nuance. For instance, we're going to talk about workflows very soon. So and Dapr offers workflows as code, and that means you have to write the workflows as code. So in that case, you do need these client SDKs to actually write your code. But for instance, to start a workflow or to stop a workflow or to pause a workflow, that you can do just by making HTTP calls. Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned workflows, and you also mentioned PubSub. What are some of the other, I guess, features or benefits I'd get as like a developer using Dapr?
Yeah, so Dapr gives you all of these building blocks, and yeah, I can scroll a bit more down because we have highlight them all like separately. Yeah, so Dapr has all of these APIs or building block APIs. So there's like service invocation if you want to like make an HTTP call to another service. I've already mentioned PubSub. There's state management, which in Dapr's case is like a key value pair state. There's also an actor model built in. Well, we're going to talk about workflow a bit more, and I'm actually going to have a workflow demo soon. There's also a jobs API, so when you can schedule jobs on a certain frequency. There's also a Secrets API. I'm actually going to demo this as well because the Stripe API I'm going to read via a Secrets API. So all of these building blocks you can combine and compose in your services, so you don't have to write all kinds of specific code to handle this yourself. And another big thing that Dapr offers is it covers the security and observability and resiliency. So you don't have to write this in your application. For instance, if your call to a service is failing, you don't have to use, for instance, you can use Poly, of course, which can help you out for this for .NET. But maybe you're using a language that doesn't provide a good resiliency library. But resiliency is actually built into the Dapr sidecar.
You know what's interesting about these building blocks as I'm looking at them, and also kind of going back to that initial question, right? Like how does a Stripe application, how do I design it, or how do I integrate Dapr with that? Like how do I put those two things together? But like as I'm looking at this, I can imagine almost any type of application, right? Not just financial applications, not just games, not just web apps, not just mobile apps.
Definitely,
these seem like very common, like you said, building blocks that almost any application that's distributed, distributed might mean like I'm talking to a database that lives in another place. I'm talking to another web server. I'm talking to like a caching service, or I don't know, like a stock pricing service or a product service or anything of the sort. Anyone that has a service, I am going to need configuration. I am going to need things like, secrets and PubSub and all those types of things. So this just seems like a common this seems like a toolkit that almost any application developer could use, because these are all things that, like, I can't imagine not building an application that doesn't have at least one of these things.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's also nice about Dapr because Dapr offers a lot, but Dapr doesn't dictate that you need to use everything. If you just want to use Dapr for PubSub messaging, or you just want to use Dapr for its secrets API, and that's it, that's also fine. It's a bit of a pick and choose runtime. Just pick the components or APIs that you need, and you can forget about the rest. And you can also slowly, incrementally increase your usage of Dapr based on your needs. So also in that respect, it's quite flexible.
Yeah, and I like that part that you mentioned, that I don't have to use everything, is what I'm understanding, right? Yeah. Like you showed like a little section with a whole bunch of different APIs.
Yes.
So I can pick and choose the things that I want. So if I did want to have like a direct dependency on RabbitMQ or Azure Service Bus, I could still do that. That's okay. Yeah, but if I wanted to leverage Dapr for secret storage and service discovery and other stuff, I can do that as well. So it's almost like I can pick and choose how deep or not I want to go when it comes to like pulling those things into my application.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think some people when they look at Dapr, they hope that it covers everything that they want to do in an application, but I don't think that's completely realistic. Dapr can probably provide like 70-80% what you need, but there will always be something that Dapr doesn't provide. But that's okay, right? You can still write any code that you would like in your application. But yeah, for the parts that where Dapr does provide the APIs, it's nice if you can use it, because it does mean your application stays like very portable.
Okay, awesome. This sounds interesting. Let's dive into the workflow part, because I think that's what folks here really are excited to hear about, and what your demo, and I believe is really based on.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
so is workflows just another, is it just not another building block, another set of APIs that we could use, or is it something else?
Yeah, it is another building block API, but it is a bit of a special one compared to all of the other ones. Because when we
Okay.
talk, for instance, about the PubSub API, we mentioned we can use like other message brokers while having like one API that we use in our application code, and then switch from RabbitMQ to Kafka to Azure or to AWS or whatever. But with Dapr Workflow, it's a bit different because Dapr has a built-in workflow engine in this Dapr sidecar process, and which is not interchangeable. So in this case, the Dapr Workflow API uses its own Dapr Workflow engine.
Okay.
And when you write your workflows, when you author your workflows, that's all part of your own application. And then the Dapr process takes care of scheduling those workflows and all these activities. And I'll share some of the slides from the Dapr open source slide deck to actually highlight what you can do with Dapr workflow.
Yeah. So, and again, just me in my head thinking about what you just said. So Dapr has a bunch of APIs. These APIs, again, state storage, PubSub, all these types of stuff. But on the other side of that is some type of implementation, like there's a database or a PubSub thing. Like those APIs abstract it. But workflows is different because it's not an abstraction over a collection of different workflow engines, but it's actually using Dapr's built-in engine. So it's similar, but it's different, right? Like it doesn't abstract anything, but it still gives you like those APIs, right? Like HTTP or gRPC that these different languages can interact with. But at the same time, it's not like me as an infrastructure person, like I don't have to provision a thing to like point Dapr to when it comes to workflows.
Yes and no, because when we talk about workflows, we're talking about durable execution. So the workflow state is still stored somewhere, and you're still responsible of choosing a storage that is suitable for your application, and which is used by Dapr workflow. But yeah, you're not selecting indeed a workflow engine, but you are selecting a Dapr compatible state store that workflow is built on top of.
Got it. So then I can also think about it like workflows kind of depends on some of the other building blocks then. Right?
Exactly.
Is that fair to say?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Maybe we can go this in maybe a bit of a reversed order, because I do think that I have some slides about that. Yeah, so what we have here on the left is a workflow application, and that basically the application that you write that contains your business logic and your workflow code, and we'll see an example of that a bit later. Your application is talking to the Dapr process that runs in the sidecar, and that process is responsible for scheduling that workflow and the activities, so that decides when it will be scheduled and when it will be executed. And that process is also responsible for persisting the workflow state to a state store, and that's a Dapr compatible state store. But this Dapr process, this Dapr workflow engine, is actually built on top of the Dapr actor framework. So under the hood, Dapr also provides an actor API. So under the hood, workflow is built on top of specific Dapr actor instances. So in this case, there's one actor that handles the workflow state, and there's also an actor for activity state. But this is really like an implementation detail. So as a consumer of Dapr workflow, you actually don't need to know about the whole actor orchestration, actor setup. It's more like an implementation detail, because when you look into the debug logs, you will see some information about actors. So I think it's good to realize and to know that Dapr workflow is built on top of actors, but you're not interacting with these actors yourself as a developer. You use the Dapr workflow API, and you're not using the actor API.
That's interesting. So like you said, so there's workflows, and workflows uses the actors, but the actor building block uses the state store. So it's almost
Exactly.
like multiple layers
Yeah,
of
yeah.
integration. But again, it's all in-house, right? Like it's all Dapr.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's all like an implementation detail, but I think it's sort of nice that Dapr is sort of dog fooding its own APIs for all of these implementations. Indeed, so Dapr workflow is built on top of Actors, and Actors built on top of the state management API. But again, you're not interacting with any of these APIs if you're just using Dapr workflow. Yeah.
Okay. So then how? So I've seen different workflow engines and orchestrators and things of that nature, and
Mhm.
some of them are based on like visually connecting things together in some type of UI. Some of
Yeah.
them are, excuse me, based on definitions in YAML. Some of them are code based. Like where
Yes.
does the Dapr workflow engine sit when it comes to like me plugging my application into it?
Yeah, so Dapr is really workflow as code. So as a developer, you write your workflow in code in the language that you're comfortable in. So Dapr workflow at the moment supports .NET, Java, JavaScript, Python, and Go.
Mhm.
So it's 5 languages. So you can use any of these 5 languages, and you can write your workflows, your Dapr workflows in code, and that all gets like scheduled by the Dapr process.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Shall I point out some of the workflow patterns maybe, or shall we move
Oh
to
yeah,
codes?
that'd be great to know.
Maybe we do some workflow patterns, Nita, because if you're not familiar to workflows, so maybe this could be interesting. Because of course, everyone's familiar with some kind of business processes, right? Executing tasks in a certain sequence. So workflows are, I think, very common tools for like automating different business processes. So one of, and these can occur in different types of, let's say, patterns, how these are executed. So the most basic one is called task chaining, and then you have like a sequence of tasks. We call them activities in Dapr, which are executed in a specific order. And that's typically because the output of an activity is then used as the input for the next activity. So that's why it's a chain.
Question about this, right?
Yeah.
So I can definitely visualize, step 1, step 2, step 3, and I'm executing in some type of sequential order.
Yeah.
What happens if I get to activity B, and example here, and I throw an exception, or I don't know, the thing that I'm trying, like the database is down or the network fails or whatever the case is. Like what happens if I have errors like in the middle of the workflow and I haven't gotten to the end yet?
You see, yeah, it depends a bit on what the error exactly is.
Okay.
Since Dapr workflows are durable, so for instance, you can actually stop the complete process. You can completely stop your own application. You can also stop the Dapr sidecar, and if you then spin up that process again, then the workflow will still continue to completion. So that's the promise of durable execution and of workflows in general. So that's great. So if your application, if your server restarts or something, or you do a new deployment, it's temporarily offline, but it will come back up and it will just keep on going. So that's great.
Okay.
If something happens in a specific activity, so maybe in activity B, we're calling out to a certain endpoint, and that endpoint returns like a error 500, like a server error. Then it depends a bit on what you do as a developer. Do you anticipate that an exception will be thrown there? So then you can try to catch it in your workflow. And if you catch that exception, you can also instruct the workflow to do maybe a compensation action, because maybe you've done something in activity A, and you always assume that things go right. But maybe if something fails, you want to undo some of your earlier activities. So that's one of the things you can do. In case of like very temporary errors, you can also instruct the Dapr workflow to do a certain number of retries. Yeah, so if you know you're communicating with a bit of a flaky service, then you can actually provide some retry policies inside your workflow. So there's ways how to deal with that.
Yeah, I can imagine then, as again, because I'm trying to build this model in my head. I can imagine. So I get to, in your case, activity B, and 500 error. I had a serialization issue. User error is my fault as a developer, right? Like something bad happened.
Yeah.
But then I could now say, hey, I want to stop this workflow here, right? because there's an error. I don't want to continue.
Yeah.
And then I'll send, I don't know, maybe I use PubSub and I send a message to be like, hey, some other system, I had an error here. I need, I don't know, human intervention, or I need someone to come and fix the record or update the thing so that then we can come back and restart the workflow. Because I'm guessing all workflows have some type of identifier that I could, say, hey, this is the one that had an issue.
Correct.
And I could be like, hey, this one had an issue. Could like a human being look at this thing and fix it? And then I could come back and restart, the process afterwards, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, but it's also still very much up to the developer how much you anticipate things going wrong and how you deal with those. So there's not inherently, so besides from that the process completely stops, if you then restart it, everything will be, all of the state will be hydrated from the state store, and that will be used again when the workflow executes again. But in case of potential exceptions and stuff like that, you still need to handle that yourself in the workflow, which is totally fine. It's all part of the business logic.
Yeah, you know what that sounds like to me? That sounds like developers actually have to write code. That sounds like what you're telling me. Are you telling me that this doesn't do everything for me? I actually have to write code to make this thing work?
I think the most important point is like understanding what's the business process, what's the business case you're actually modeling, which you're automating. So you have to understand it really well. And also when business processes are executed by humans, humans also make mistakes. So hopefully you have a good description of that business process. And then the mistakes that can happen with humans can also happen with electronic systems. So hopefully indeed you have that well documented, or you need to find out what to do if this fails, what kind of compensation action do I need to make sure, or do we need to do a PubSub message somewhere? Definitely need to think about that.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. So the framework and the APIs provide a way for you to, again, durably execute these long running steps, right, in a persistent way. But at the end of the day, like, you as a developer, you still have to know what your steps are, and you have to know what does a successful completion look like, and know how you want to handle it if there's any type of errors or issues, right? Like, you still have to, speak with your business analysts, speak with, your stakeholders, your, whoever in your company, to kind of figure out, well, when bad things happen, how do we want to react to that?
Yeah, I think that's that's a skill that will always remain here, right? So no matter how many AI tools we have, we still need to understand the business problem.
That is true, 100%. Okay. Yeah, this was awesome. Okay, so I know we kind of went in a tangent, but this is one of the
one of the
patterns, workflow patterns, right? And I'm guessing that there's some others as well.
I won't go cover them all in detail, but this is definitely used in the demos. This is useful to know. So the order is important. Then another one is called fan out, fan in. In this case, you run activities like in not a sequence, but in parallel, and they don't have any relation. So they're completely independent. The Dapr workflow engine will try to schedule them all at the same time, and the workflow will actually wait until all of them have been completed, or until like the first has been completed. So again, that's up to you, the developer, how you decide which is suitable for your business logic.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense.
And this example is also used in the demo later. So I'll skip the code slides because we will jump to code soon.
Sure.
Another pattern that's often used is called the monitor pattern. So this is very useful when you do like a recurring activity. So maybe you do like a daily cleanup job in your cloud environment or something, maybe by the end of the day, because as a developer, you might create some resources. But in order to prevent too many cloud costs, you maybe run a workflow, this monitor workflow, where you program an activity that cleans up some cloud resources, and you just want to do this as a reoccurring event on a daily basis. And so this first activity task is then like we call out to, for instance, the Azure cloud and clean up some resources. Then we can use a timer. That's one of the methods on the workflow. And then we can instruct the workflow to wait a certain amount of time. So we can say, okay, now wait for 24 hours. And once that 24 hours is over, then we can instruct the workflow to continue as a new instance. So we have to forget about all of your previous history, all of these executions, start as a fresh instance and go in a loop, because that's basically what it is. This is just like a do while loop that never ends.
That's interesting. That's an interesting thought because it made me think about maybe this is the same pattern or another pattern, but like as workflows are executing, I'm assuming that there's an API or an endpoint that I could call to check the status, regardless
Yes.
of whatever pattern we're using, right? I'm guessing we
Yeah,
can
yeah,
say,
yeah, yeah.
hey, is
Exactly.
it done or is it not done? Is it running?
Yes.
What number step are we at the moment, kind of thing?
Yeah, there's like a get status endpoint, and we're actually going to use it as well in the demo to actually check if a workflow is in a running state, or is it completed, or it's in a fail state. It doesn't return where in the workflow it is,
Mhm.
but again, as a developer, you can add that because the workflow has a property called custom state.
Yeah.
So after each activity execution, you can actually update that custom state field with what was the latest activity you have just executed, for instance.
Yeah. But I remember seeing in a previous slide that Dapr supports OpenTelemetry, right? So
Yes,
does
yes.
if I had like a visualization tool like, I don't know, Grafana or what's that other thing, like Prometheus or any of
Yeah,
those types of graphing things,
yeah,
right?
you can
I'm
definitely.
sure,
Yeah.
I'm guessing that I could plug Dapr together with it, and then maybe it won't show me the exact one, but at least I could be able to see like the workflow as a, what's that thing called? A trace and
Yeah,
span
trace. Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
throughout the thing.
Yeah. I had Dapr has distributed tracing and workflow is nicely integrated with that, so you can definitely see all of the interactions that workflow has in observability tooling. That's definitely true.
Yeah.
But yeah, you only see it based on traces, right? So then you don't have like a visualization of your entire workflow, but you can see what kind of touch points did my
Yeah.
traces go through. So it does provide information on where am I now in this request. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
good.
awesome. I think what I'm getting at for all of this is, even with workflow being like an embedded engine within Dapr, it still builds on top of so many other things, right? So it sounds like
True.
I can make use of the open telemetry support. I can make use of the resiliency stuff. And in the background it's using actors and it's using storage and it's using all these
Yeah.
other things, right? And so I think it sounds like workflow is a good example of like me building a thing on top of Dapr while still utilizing some of those other APIs and stuff like that
Yeah.
that kind of come out of the box.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think it really makes you very efficient as a developer, right? Because you
Yeah.
can focus on writing your own business process as workflow as code, but don't have to worry about all of that other stuff because that's already written for you and
Yeah.
running in the Dapr sidecar. So yeah, definitely.
Okay. I feel like we've spoken to folks to death at this point.
Yeah.
I'm
Let's
very sure people want to see a demo
some
right
code.
now. They
Let's
want
do
to
some
see
code.
some code and to see
Yes.
something running.
Yeah.
So
Oh, but
why
by
don't
the
we
way, if you would like this presentation is also available in the Dapr docs. So go to docs dapr.io/contributing/presentations. You can download the entire slide deck, which is huge. So if you ever want to give Dapr presentation, then this is the best source. All right.
Awesome.
Okay.
I like the wallpaper.
yeah, this was from a while ago.
Love it.
All right. So what I did, and by the way, this is also just available to all of you. It's in Git repo. So what I did is, of course, I wanted to check how can we integrate Stripe with Dapr workflow, and I was very interested in the meter aspect because I think a lot of companies are building like SaaS products these days, and especially maybe when it comes to all kinds of AI agent integrations. So I think, okay, how can we incorporate meters in Dapr workflow? But before I could actually use a meter, I had to, of course, add a meter, and I didn't want to do that all like directly in the Stripe dashboard. I thought, okay, why not do the whole construction setup, like create that in a workflow first. So I ended up with two workflows. One workflow is that you see here. So I create first a Stripe customer, I create the meter, and then I have an array called product price. So I create a product, I create a price, and I create a subscription. And then I have all the prerequisites so that a meter is available, which I then can use in another application. And that's the metering demo workflow app. So this is the actual workflow that will use the meter.
Yeah.
And what will happen here is first there will be an activity where I identify the customer based on an email, and then this will start a child workflow. I didn't mention that pattern, but you can have like nested workflows. And this child workflow is then composed of a call to a large language model. And then I end with creating a Stripe meter event. And this is using the fan out, fan in pattern, because based on the number of prompts that I specify as an input, that and then determines how many meter events I create at this end.
Yeah. Okay. So then, are you creating a meter per customer? Is that what?
And no. That's not what's happening. So I can quickly go over through the setup.
Yeah, let's do it
here. So what happens here is, okay, so this is the workflow definition. Make it a bit better. So basically, workflow is just a .NET class. I'm doing everything in .NET here. You inherit from a base class, abstract base class called workflow. You specify an input and output. You can define these yourselves. These are like POCOs. And you have to implement the run async method. So that's an abstract method in this class. And you use this workflow context to make calls to other activities, to the individual activities that you want to have executed. So my first one is the create customer activity. And so based on my input, and by the way, this is my input. So I have like a customer name, customer email, an array of product prices, and then a meter name and the meter event name. So the first activity that I'm calling is the create customer, which then creates a Stripe customer in the backend. Then here you see some business logic, right? So if my create customer activity, if it's not successful, then I'm stopping the workflow. And I'm indicating what the actual problem is, and providing some information back. If not, I continue and create a Stripe meter based on the meter name and the meter event name. Again, if that's not successful, I just stop the workflow. And after that, I iterate over the product and price information that I provide, and then create a product. I create a price for that product, and that also has the meter information. And finally, I create a subscription, which is again a combination of price and customer.
Nice. Okay. So like the code that I'm looking at here looks very, and I know this is probably intentional, but it looks very sequential. You know what I mean?
Yes.
I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, where, like where does the complexity come in, right? Because I know workflows is such a, like we talk about like storing states, and we talk about persisting the steps, and I'm assuming what'll happen is that like I'll just continue from the next step, and I don't have to run the entire workflow from in entirety. But like as a developer, I'm looking at this code and I'm just like, I'm guessing it happens automatically for me, because there's no function or there's no method call being called that says checkpoint here or save state here or
no,
you know what I mean, persists progress here or anything of the sort. It just kind of happens, right?
Yeah, that's all. Yeah, the Dapr workflow, and Dapr itself, the runtime, this takes care of all of that. So you just see function calls, activity calls. What's actually happening is as soon as this workflow is started, and I will actually show you how to actually start it. The Dapr workflow engine will then see, okay, I have this workflow, and I'll create a new instance of a workflow with a specific ID. We also mentioned that earlier. Then when we schedule this call, when we await this call, then this workflow will stop executing, and then this activity call will be scheduled. Right. So at this moment, once this activity call is scheduled, this workflow is completely gone. Once this activity is completed, and by the way, all of the inputs and outputs for this activity are also persisted to the storage. So when this activity is completed, also the outputs are persisted to storage, and then this workflow will restart, and it will restart completely from the top. So it will enter here in this run async method again. Then it will first reach this activity again, but we already executed this. But Dapr workflow knows that it has already executed this activity call. So we're not going to execute this activity call again because we will actually read the state from the state store. And so we rehydrate the state, and then we continue to the next part. So from that moment, it will continue again. So whenever you see a context call activity async, from that moment on, an activity will be scheduled, but the workflow will stop. And after the activity is completed, the workflow will restart again, but it will always restart from the top, from this run async method.
Got it. So two questions I have to ask for you.
Yeah.
So you mentioned just a little while ago that the inputs and the outputs will get persisted in the,
Yes.
I guess, in the history table or the storage persistent state, right?
Yeah.
But like I'm looking at, so at line 9, for instance, right? I'm guessing create customer output is an example of an output type, and that's a custom type that you created.
Yes,
So,
exactly.
And for folks that are watching, this is .NET, but whether it's Python or Java or JavaScript, Rust, whatever the case is, right? Like I'm assuming it'll be the same thing, that you'll have some type that you can or cannot, pass in as input or retrieve as, output. So Dapr is going to go ahead and take care of the serialization of those types for you, right? Exactly. Because I'm guessing that these are not types that Dapr gave you, right? These are your custom.
No, yeah, those are my types. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I've created them here. Yeah, and I always recommend to keep these types like very small, because as you mentioned, all of this will be serialized and deserialized, so it will be very inefficient if these are like very big objects. Yeah. So I'll always try to keep these very small and mainly use like IDs and very small properties between all these activities. Yeah, correct.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, let me just show you maybe one of the activities, because there's a lot of similarity, as you can see, right? So it's always the same pattern, always call activity. We specify the name of the activity, and we specify an input, and what we get back is an output. And indeed, the order is important here, because we need this created customer things for stuff later. So for instance, we needed to create a subscription. So that's why we need the customer ID here. And the meter information we create here, well, we need it for to create a price here. So that's why we have this chaining order, because the outputs of these activity calls are required as inputs for activities later. So that's why we cannot do like a fan out, fan in, and because we have this dependency on information that needs to be passed in.
Gotcha. Okay.
Let's just have a look at one activity here before we move on to the other workflow, which is actually using the metering. So this is an example of an activity. So an activity is this a small unit that's being scheduled and executed by the Dapr workflow. Again, it's just a basic class you inherit from workflow activity. You again specify the input and the output that you want to use. You can have full control over that. It's very similar in setup as a workflow class itself. So again, you need to override the run async method, and now you have a workflow context, and you have an input here. But in an activity, you can put any code that you want. So I did mention before, but your workflow code needs to be deterministic. So it's a bit limited what you can do inside a workflow, because of the workflow replays over and over again. All of the inputs and outputs to and from activities always needs to result in exactly the same values. Otherwise, the state between your state store and between your running instance, if there's a mismatch in that, then you don't have like a proper execution of your workflow. So that's why all of your code in the workflow needs to be deterministic, and any non-deterministic code that you have, you need to put them in activities. So that's what we're doing here.
Okay. So then it sounds like activities, I can do what I want.
Exactly. Yeah. So exactly. So whenever you call out to a database or to an external API or whatever, all of that you need to wrap into an activity. So that's why my workflow code was only like calling activities and some if statements, and that's basically what you should do in a workflow. But interacting with the Stripe API, that you should do inside an activity. Gotcha.
And then so then we can think about like the workflow as like the workflow type inside of the code as an orchestrator, right? Yes. And the orchestrator is saying, hey, run these things in this order, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then the activity as being the actual steps, right? Like this is the unit of execution that I want this step to encompass. Kind of
exactly. Yeah. And in this case, we have a create customer activity. So in this case, it's creating a Stripe customer. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. So like you said here, you could like you mentioned, you could just new up the Stripe SDK or like one of our Stripe services, and then you could say, create customer, create products,
Exactly.
so on and so forth, and then go ahead and get stuff taken care of.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. And in this case, I'm using the Stripe configuration API key, which then points to an API key. And I'm actually using the Dapr secrets API. So I'm using the Dapr client here to get me a secret.
Nice.
And I then need to point to a secret store name and then point to a Stripe key name. So this retrieves a secret key that they set here for Stripe. And in this case, I'm running everything locally. So in this case, I'm just pointing to a JSON file which contains my key. But if I'm running in production, I can use like something like Azure Key Vault or HashiCorp Vault, for instance.
Yeah, nice.
Okay.
And that looks pretty easy to, at least in terms of like calling the secret store, right? Like, hey, I need this thing from this place. What I mean?
Yeah. I can actually show you. I should show you indeed where it's configured, right? Because like I mentioned, so this is an abstraction over an underlying, of course, resource. So I have like a folder called resources here. And this is the file that actually contains the values, which of course in production you wouldn't have. Then you would point to something else. But the configuration of what my secret store actually is configured in this secret store YAML file. This is of a type secret stores.local.file. As it's purely intended for local development. And in this case, we are using a secrets file, and this is just the path that actually points to this secrets.json.
Okay. So let's go back again in a quick second.
Yes.
So we have Dapr, right? And so Dapr is a process that has these different APIs that are available, right?
Yeah.
Secrets being one of those APIs. And so what you're showing here is the definition of how we want to not really expose the API, but how we want to configure the thing in the back that's actually implementing the API, right? So like this one, I'm guessing line 7, it says secret stores local file. So I'm guessing this is good for like testing and debugging and stuff like that.
Only for local development.
This is not for production, right? Because it says local file. This is not for like your thousands and thousands of distributed services, right? But I'm guessing there's other types, and you might have a secret store type that says Azure Key Vault, HashiCorp.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so for
so
Azure,
on and so
like
forth.
this Key Vault. So this would be the type for Azure Key Vault, and that comes then with its separate set metadata specific for Azure Key Vault. Yeah.
Right, and so and you're showing this for the secret store, but I'm guessing it's the same for PubSub. I'm guessing it's the same for state store and all of these other things, right? Like I have these YAML files that define the thing that implements the resource, the thing that implements the thing that the API is actually talking to. But then now I can check this in with my source code, right? And I can version this with my source code. But still, as a developer, I don't need to be concerned about the infrastructure as much, right? The infrastructure for me is a YAML file, right? And then someone else
can
deal with the rest of it.
As a developer, you probably have your own set of YAML files that you can just use locally, and then you have like probably like a CI/CD pipeline where you like inject other values, or maybe inject a whole new YAML file that contains the configuration used for production.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, and for instance, this is we call these component files because like the infrastructure resources in Dapr terms are called components, and this is then a component file for state.redis, because when you use Dapr locally and you install the Dapr CLI, you also get a container that runs Redis. So by default, use the Redis key value state store for anything that's locally with state. And that just points to a local running container.
But now, because the workflow engine is different, because the workflow engine is inside of Dapr, I'm assuming that there's no YAML file for workflows.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, there's no YAML file for workflow because we need to use the built-in one. And the only thing that you need to make sure that you set is you need to set this actor state store flag to true, because workflows are dependent on actors, so that's why we need to configure the actor state store flag to true for our state store. Yeah, so this is the only requirements that you need to configure to use Dapr workflow with state. Yeah,
Got it. And I'm gonna assume that I can't have multiple of those, right? Like I can't have multiple state stores with extra state set to true. So I'm guessing Dapr is gonna be like, no, you can't do that. And
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you can have like multiple state stores, but you have to make sure that you have like unique names then. So that's that. But Anita, when it comes to like state, I think you are only allowed to have like one active state store to true indeed.
Gotcha. Yeah. That makes sense. Okay. All right. So I feel like we've seen the workflow, like the actual workflow implementation and the activities, and then how to set it up. How do you actually call the workflow? Like, how do you start it?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, for this, I'm going to go to the other one, which actually uses the metering. So we actually just run it. So we're going to switch from this setup Stripe workflow app to this metering one. Yeah, this one. So the workflow itself is defined in this file. Again, we are just calling out to activities, etc. But how do we start this? Well, in this case, we're going to start it by just making an HTTP call. So I have like a minimal web API project here, where I have like a post configured, and when I call the /run endpoint with a certain input, I will get my workflow client from our services collection, and then I'm using the schedule new workflow async method on the workflow client. I mention the name of the workflow, and I pass in the input, and this will actually. And now the Dapr runtime takes over, and it will actually schedule it. We schedule workflow. The workflow will, of course, be executed by the application itself, but the scheduling and when the workflow takes over and when the activity takes over is all handled by Dapr. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So when I call the /run method, then it will be executed. So I think you should just try this. I need to first run a command to start both my application and the Dapr sidecar. So I got this in a README here. I'll scroll down a bit. Oops. So I'm going to copy paste this. So I'm going to use the Dapr CLI. I'm going to call Dapr run, and then I'm going to specify an application ID because it's very important that every application has a unique ID when you deal with Dapr. So this is called the meter app. I'm also pointing to a resources path which contains my YAML files, so Dapr knows which state store to use, etc. And then I'm specifying some application ports because this is a servers we can call into. And finally, this is a project, so I'm using .NET Run, and then specifying the path where my project is.
Okay, and so this is just running the Dapr sidecar, right? But it's running it and showing, not showing, but like pointing at those resource definitions that you showed us, as well as running whatever application. So in this case, it's .NET, but it could be Python, it could be Node. It could be,
in case of Python, you would say like Python 3, and then your Python project. Yeah, exactly.
Gotcha.
Indeed. All right. So now everything is spinning up. We see that the application is building.
Nice. And then we get, so what we're seeing now is like all those different logs.
We see, so we see logs from both the Dapr process, but also our application process. So I think this at the moment is all Dapr. So it's quite verbose because it's by default it shows everything, but you can configure that. So now our application is up and running, and our Dapr process is up and running. But now we need to make this HTTP call to the run endpoint to actually schedule our workflow. So I have this HTTP file here. Yeah, I'm a very big fan of VS Code, so I'm using VS Code and a lot of the extensions in VS Code. So I'm also using the REST client in VS Code. So you can create these .http files, and then you have this send request link or button, and then you can actually make a call by just writing stuff like this. So I'm going to do a post call to this application URL, which I defined here, to the run method, and then I have like a JSON body, which then has a customer email, and then 2 prompts, which I'll be executing. I didn't show it yet, but actually the prompts are being executed by another Dapr API that's called the Conversation API, which is a new API to actually interact with different LLM providers.
Oh, nice.
So I'm going to run this, and then the response will be shown here at the right. So we'll see that. So I'm going to now make the request. So I get back a to or to accept it, because everything with Dapr workflow is asynchronous, and the workflow can be a very long running process. So workflows can be running for hours or weeks or months. So you don't get back the workflow result, but we get back a to accept it. So there's a lot of logging going on, and what you can already see that the orchestration status is completed here in the logs. But like you mentioned before, there's also a status endpoint that you can call to find out what the state of the workflow is. And what I called before was an endpoint in our application. But in this case, I am calling directly to the Dapr process. So I'm calling out to the workflows endpoint. Dapr is the workflow engine in this case. And what we get back, we got back an instance ID of the workflow. So that's this. So that's 25BEE. And that's what we are providing to this endpoint. So we want to get the status of this workflow instance. So when I get this sent a request here, and now we see here some information about a workflow. So we see the instance ID, we see when it's created, last updated, we see the runtime status, it's completed, and we also see indeed what our inputs and outputs are. So our inputs were customer email was input, and then we provided 2 prompts: explain Dapr, the distributed application runtime, in 1 sentence, and then the other prompt was, if Dapr and Stripe was a superhero duo, who would they be and why? Explain in 2 sentences. And this is then the output. Dapr is an open source portable runtime that helps developers build resilient microservice-based applications by providing a set of building blocks for common distributed computing challenges. And the response of the other one was that if Dapr and Stripe were a superhero duo, they would be Batman and Robin of the infrastructure world. Dapr would be Batman, providing a versatile framework that enables seamless distributed application development, while Stripe would be Robin, the agile payment processing sidekick that ensures smooth financial transactions across platforms.
I love it. I love it. I love it. I love it. Question about this particular format. So Dapr workflow input, Dapr workflow output. So it looks like those are both serialized in JSON, right? So it's almost like we have a double serialization thing going on, right? We have JSON and JSON.
Exactly. Yeah, indeed.
Can I change the input output serialization format, or is it just JSON and we can't change it?
That's a good. I'm not sure if you have control over how it's serialized. Maybe because of course that's an SDK thing. So maybe indeed you can configure it in the .NET Dapr SDK in this case. I never looked into it. That's a good question.
Yeah, I'm curious. I'll have to look up that myself too. I'm kind of curious.
To be honest, normally I wouldn't really bother with a workflow output. Because you need to get this output to see it. What I would typically do, I would have like a final activity in my workflow that has the output and that stores it in a database, or that creates a notification or something. And I would have that as the final action, and not bother with a workflow output that you need to get yourself, and that you need to poll for.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
This is just nice for demos.
Nice. That makes sense. That makes sense. Okay. So you did mention that there's a conversations thing. Can we look at that really quick?
Yeah. So here I have my activities that I'm calling, and one of the is the call LM activity. So here we go. I can close this. So in this activity, run a sync method. I am preparing conversation inputs. So there's some work has been done in this case the .NET SDK to provide some additional types that Dapr offers now. So you can prepare conversational inputs, and in this case I am adding the prompt that I provide from my own custom type to this Dapr conversational input. So I provide the content field for this input. You can provide a role where you can be a bit more clear from am I interacting as a human or as a computer, or in this case I just provide generic. One of the what I think very nice features of the Dapr Conversation API is that you can obfuscate the personal identifiable information. So if you set the scrub PII value to true, If you happen to pass in like emails or credit card information or whatever sensitive information, the Dapr runtime will actually obfuscate that, so you won't send sensitive information to the LLM. It will also scrub what comes out of the LLM as well. So this works in two directions.
Nice.
So this is an optional value. I think it's false by default, but I'm not exactly sure. But you can check the SDK source code on GitHub. But I think this is a nice feature of the LLM.
Nice.
And here I usually
Question.
Yeah.
So today is March 26th. Last week, I think it was last week or maybe the week prior, OpenAI released a new SDK. I think it's called Responses or something of the sort. But with the Responses SDK, I'm bringing this up because of line 25 in your code. They released a new role, right? I don't know how that works. I don't know if they've released a new role or they just added a new one. But I'm guessing inside of Dapr, as an example, like if I wanted to add a new role, would I have to set it based on what the LLM is, right? Because right now, as an example, I think only OpenAI supports the developer role, right?
Right.
But then there's system role, there's user role, there's so on and so forth, and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So this is. It depends, of course, with which LLM is using this. But as a default, it is like a required parameter when using the Dapr conversation API. This role.
So that we can just does this resolve to like a string? Can I just make a string as an example and just like if I wanted to add another one, or is this like an enum that we'd have?
This is an enum, but in this case, I'm also using the .NET SDK. You can use the conversation API just with straight HTTP calls, right? So you're not limited to.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay,
you still make raw HTTP calls to the conversation API endpoint of Dapr.
Yeah. I think that's one of the interesting things. One of the fun and frustrating things about working in the AI space right now, because things are changing so quickly,
so fast. Yes.
And so as we write applications, whether we write it with Dapr or with LangChain or with name your framework, LLM framework of choice, like I feel like these APIs are changing so quickly that we have to, as folks that are building these frameworks and things of that nature, we have to be so responsive to change.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And to be very transparent, so the conversation API is an alpha API in Dapr. So it means don't use it for production just yet, because it's not yet as battle tested as, for instance, the workflow API, which is a stable API. So definitely expect things to change a lot, especially because the AI field is still very new. When things are marked as alpha in Dapr, then it's very likely that the API will still change.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. So with that being said, Marc, I think we're close to the end.
Yep.
Before we close, though, I do want to ask. So if folks are interested in learning more about just Dapr and Dapr and Diagrid and stuff like that, like where are some good places for us to go to get more involved with the community and stuff that's happening here?
I think first checking the Dapr website is probably the best place to get acquainted with Dapr. So the Dapr Discord is a good one, but if you go to the Dapr website, there are many links to the Dapr Discord there, so that's good. I think there's also a link on the Dapr website that points to Dapr University, so that's something new we're building with Diagrid, so that really helps you to get like a good onboarding experience if you're very new to Dapr. So there's Dapr 101 course now, and I'm now working on the Dapr workflow course. So in a couple of weeks, you can follow the Dapr workflow course on Dapr University.
Nice. So we have Dapr University, Dapr.io and Dapr.io/docs, so the documentation.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And if people want to try out this repo, it's all out in the open. So definitely give this a spin if you're interested in combining Dapr workflow with Stripe.
Yeah, and then we have the link on the screen now. So for folks that want to get Marc's code and play around with it and see examples of how to use workflows, how to set up the configuration for those different components, resources, and how to use the conversation API. You can go ahead and check that out there as well. Mark, are you guys going anywhere? Do you have any like
Oh yeah,
conferences you're going to, or like where can people meet you in person?
Thanks for the reminder. Yeah. So we're going to be at KubeCon next week in London. We're going to have like a Dapr booth there at the Project Pavilion. I'm going to be there. Two other maintainers and are also going to be there. And we also have a Diagrid booth as well. So you can find us at multiple places at KubeCon. And there's also going to be a lot of Dapr related sessions as well. There's also a blog post on the Dapr blog about all of the Dapr related sessions. I think there's about 8 different sessions at KubeCon.
Nice.
So quite a lot. Yes.
Nice. That's fantastic. Well, Mark, thank you so much for coming on, man. I really appreciate you. And I feel like I've learned a lot about how to plug Dapr in, and hopefully the folks that are watching have learned how we could take Stripe and Dapr and bring them together to make Batman and Robin, right?
Exactly.
Really fun applications. I haven't gotten a chance to play around with that Conversations API. So I think that's going to be one of the next things that I try and dig around with and see how that works for sure. But for those of you that are watching, again, if you have different use cases for Stripe, for Dapr, for like bringing these two things together and making really fun and interesting applications, we'd definitely love to know. So definitely feel free to leave a comment in the bottom of this video. Reach out to us on our social media pages, whether it's our LinkedIn, our YouTubes, our Twitter/X/Blue Sky/Mastodon / all the things. We'd definitely love to hear from you. So feel free to reach out and let us know. But with that being said, thank you so much for joining us. Mark, thank you again. And we'll see you again next time for another Stripe Developer Office Hours. Okay. Bye, everyone.